Good morning, Rutherford County. This is Brent and Mariana Cordis with you this morning, and we're so grateful to be here, and we're so excited to be here and share with you with what God's been showing us and God's been walking us through in these days and these hours. We wanted to share about making the right choice, and we have a few examples in the Bible we'd like to share with you because every day we make thousands of choices, whether we realize it or not. And are we making the right ones? Are we asking Jesus what choices to make? Because it all makes a difference this day and hour with everything that's going on and everything that's happening around us. We want to know, we don't want to be confused, and we want to know, are we making the right choice, and are we asking Jesus to help us make those choices?
I would like to talk to you today about Daniel. I work in healthcare and we've been faced with such a trying time in our careers. It's been difficult. It's been difficult for the families, for the patients, for us as the providers. And I've been reading a lot about Daniel, and the Bible talks about the people of Judah being taken exile into captivity, into Babylon. And the king of Babylon had asked for the young man, the best looking young man, the wise ones, the ones without blemish that could come in to the king's palace, and he wanted to impart into them their culture. He wanted them to learn all about Babylon, and he wanted them to be a part of their kingdom. How does that apply to us today? What do we want our children to be like? Do we want our children to be like this world that is decaying and going from bad to worse? And when they're taken into strange circumstances, does that apply to us? Do we When we face difficult things, when we face different things, do we ask God? Do we have the fear of God in our hearts of what God has taught us, that we should not go beyond what God has taught us, that this is the right path, this is not the right path, this is the right thing to do, this is not the right thing to do? And, Daniel, right in the first chapter of Daniel, it talks about he determined in his heart. It says, Daniel determined in his heart that he would not defile himself by eating his portion of the king's rich and dainty food, or by drinking the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might be allowed not to defile himself. And he was just a young man. And I think about how strong was the fear of God in his heart, that he could stand up to somebody high up in power and say, look, I cannot do this. God has told me not to do this. I would like to excuse myself. This is what I can do. This is what I cannot do. And God was so with him and his three friends. He chose not to contaminate himself, not to pollute himself, not to do what everybody else was doing just because it seemed the right thing to do. And he was not going to dishonor and be a disgrace to God. And I constantly check myself. Is that how I want to be every day? Is that when I'm faced with something difficult, whether it's a career choice, whether it's a relationship choice, whether it's a medical treatment choice, whether it's whatever it may be, whether it's my children, are we asking God, are we going back deep in our hearts and saying, God, what would you like me to do? What is your will in this situation? And after a while, Daniel first had asked for vegetables and drink, and then after a while, and just water to drink, not wine. And he was given a period of trial, and after that he looked better than the other men that had been eating off the king's dainty foods and his wine. Look how God was with him, because he stood with God and he chose to stand up for his conviction and for what God had taught him throughout his childhood, through his parents, through whoever he was with. And then it talks about Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When the king Nebuchadnezzar had made image, a golden image, and he had made a decree that everybody in that kingdom should bow down and pay homage and worship that idol. But what happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They would not bow down. When the music played, they stood up. They were high up in the government. They didn't think about what the others thought about them. They were strong in their conviction. They were strong in the commandments of God to the Israelites, in that they should not worship another God, any God besides their true God. And they answered the king. When he came to them, he gave him another chance. He said, "Is it true, O Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, that you are not going to pay homage to my image that I have built? Is it really true what I'm hearing about you? I expect you to do better than that." And is that what we hear these days when God has told us to not to do something, and those seductive spirits, everything comes at you not to do what God has told you? Do we have that deep faith in God, the trust and the conviction that we do not waver? We are immovable, unshakable in what God has said. And they answered the king and they said, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to answer you on this point. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to rescue us from this furnace of blazing fire, and he will rescue us from your hand. But even if he does not, O king," look how strong they were in their faith, their trust, and it didn't matter to them the outcome. "If God did not rescue them, let it be known to you, O king, that we're not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." They knew the God that they served. They knew that God was able to rescue them. But yet, if God didn't see fit to rescue them, they were not changing their mind, because they had a deep devotion and love for God all the way through. It didn't matter if they faced death. Being thrown in the fiery furnace is not a pleasant thing, and it's not an easy choice to be faced with. But they chose God regardless of any outcome that they could have. And it keeps talking about Daniel. Then Daniel was a high up in the government then, and God placed him there because he walked blamelessly before God. He prayed to God 3 times a day. He was not ashamed of that. And they could not find fault with Daniel. They couldn't find it. So they saw fit to come after what they knew could get Daniel in trouble. And that was the praying that Daniel did to his God, his devotion, his pouring out his heart to God every day. And it said that Daniel sat by the same window, or by a window, and he prayed to God 3 times a day. And those people came to the king then and said, "King, you need to make a decree that nobody can pray to anyone except you." And the king didn't realize what was going on then, and he made the decree. And then they came to the king and said, "Daniel, your servant, is the one that prayed. He is found praying by that window to his God 3 times a day." And the king was disturbed, but it was too late then to change the decree. And so the king came to Daniel, and Daniel had no choice then. When the king came to him, even though the king felt sorry for the choice he had made, Daniel couldn't back up. Daniel was strong in God, even though he faced death, even though he faced being thrown in the lion's den. It didn't matter to him. So when they came to the den, the king came and cried with a voice of anguish. And the king said to Daniel, the following morning, the king went up. He couldn't sleep. He fasted. He was troubled because he knew he had done the wrong thing. But a lot of times we do the wrong thing. But thank God today we can turn to God and cry out to Him for repentance. When we make the wrong choices, if we have conviction, let's stop. Let's take a minute and say, "Jesus, what is this fog and torment and that I feel. If I've done wrong, Jesus, please change my heart. Forgive me. Help me to stand. Help me to do what's right. And so the king came with a voice of anguish the next morning and cried out to Daniel and said, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, is your God whom you serve continually able to deliver you from the lions?" And Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever." That was a relief that he could cry out to God. And Daniel the king was relieved when he heard Daniel's voice. And he said, "My God has sent his angel and has shut the lions' mouths, so they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent and blameless before him, and also before you, O king. As you very well know, I have done no harm or wrong." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel should be taken out of the lion's den. Daniel believed and trust in God all the way through. It's a difficult situation. It's a difficult day that we live in with different things we have to face. But are we trusting in God? Are we relying on God? Are we adhering to God all the more when we are faced in a hardship? And what are we willing to trade for our relationship with God? Is it a career? Is it money? Is it a house? Is it a car? What idol is it in our heart that's going to keep us from going to heaven? And working in healthcare with a lot of people losing their lives, what is it worth it when you're laying there and you have nobody with you, and you've spent your life in search of riches, in search of fame, in search of a career? And what do you have to stand up to God and say, "God, here's what I've done with my life. You've given me so much and I've served you. I've cried out to you"? Or do we have anything to present to God when we'll face him on Judgment Day? Do we have the assurance in our hearts that we're crying out to him, that he can turn to us and say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter into my rest. Enter into peace." And we can have peace today when we know we're walking with God and we're crying out to him when we need something, when we are faced in a difficult time. What is it in our hearts that we're willing to give up and sell our soul? That it may seem pleasure, it may seem good, it may seem right now, it may seem the right path, but is it the path that God has planted and chosen for us before the foundation of this world? We need to turn our hearts to God all the more. We see the signs all around us. If Jesus comes back soon, we want to have our hearts ready. We want to be ready to face Judgment Day and have the assurance in our hearts that we're walking with Jesus, that we've done our best, that we have endeavored and cried out to God to be unshakable and unmovable by all the devil throws in our path. There is many examples in the Bible, and we want to follow those examples of people that went through hardship. They went through difficult times, but instead of turning out to be bitter, offended at God, they came out on the other side stronger, a shining light, brighter, to be examples for us today.
Yes, and making those decisions is very, very important, and making the right ones. And it's all where are we listening to Jesus speak to us each day and as we walk through our day. And one example I want to share with you is about Joseph and how God spoke to him early on in his life what was going to happen, and it ended up he kept that word of God in his heart, and it ended up being fulfilled. And in Genesis 37, it says, "And he said to his brothers, 'Listen now, I pray you, this dream that I have dreamed. We brothers were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves stood round about my sheaf and bowed down. And his brothers said to him, Shall you indeed reign over us? Or are you going to have us as your subjects and dominate us?" And they hated him all the more for his dreams and for what he said. And behold, Joseph dreamed another dream. And he said, "I've dreamed another one. And this time not only did the 11 stars, but also the sun and the moon bow down and did reverence to me." And he told it to his father, as well as his brothers. And his father rebuked him and says, "What are you meaning by this dream?" He said, "Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come bow down ourselves to earth and do homage to you?" And this really made his brothers very envious of him and very, very jealous of what he said, because they realized that their father really loved him and showed partiality to him. And it made them all the more angry at him. And so one day his brothers went to go shepherd the sheep, and they had wandered very far from home. So Jacob sent Joseph to go find them. And as he found them, they wanted to get rid of him. And so they ended up throwing him in a pit. And one of the brothers had pity on him and didn't want him to die there. So they saw a band of people going down to Egypt, and they ended up selling them to him as a slave. And at every point, Joseph had a choice here. He knew he was in a bad situation, and he didn't know what to do. He knew what God had spoke to him, and that's all that could carry him through all this. And so they raised him up out of the pit. They sold him as a slave to this band of Egyptians, and then they ended up selling him to one of the officers of Pharaoh. And so when he was working there for the officer realized something special was about Joseph. There was something special that he recognized, because everything he did prospered, and everything he did was done very well. And that just showed me that it didn't matter what happened to Joseph or how his circumstances changed. He still maintained that relationship with Jesus and with God, and he still held on to the word of the Lord. And in chapter 39, Joseph was helping the officer of Pharaoh, and the officer's wife started trying to seduce him. And right there he had a choice. Was he going to be seduced by her? Or was he going to stand for what the convictions he had in his heart? And we got to realize we're faced with that every day. Are we going to do something? At first, we may feel a conviction not to do something, but then the devil keeps coming to us over and over and over, every different angle. He may use our family members. He may use people at our job. He may use our classmates, and they come over and over, coming at us to try to seduce us and pull us away from that word that God spoke to our hearts, and make us make the wrong decisions. But he didn't let that seduction pull on him, and he did not be seduced by her. And so she ended up lying about him and to her husband, which was the officer. And so they had Joseph put in prison. And right there, how many of us has that happened to? Maybe you are in a physical prison, but how many of us are in a prison in our own hearts because we let circumstances do that to us, and we listened and took offense and let that happen to our own lives. But even in prison, God showed mercy to Joseph, and the prison guard realized there was something special about Joseph, and he put everybody in that section of the prison in Joseph's care, and he took care of all of them. And one day there was two more people that came into prison, and it was the butler and the baker for Pharaoh, who was the king of Egypt. And they woke up sad one day, and Joseph went to ask him, "Hey, what's going on? Why do you look this way?" And they both had dreamed a dream that was related to what their jobs were when they were helping Pharaoh. And the dream that the butler had was about serving Pharaoh again. And then the dream that the baker had was about not serving Pharaoh again. And he ended up, the birds ate the food that he had baked. And so Joseph was able to give them the interpretation and told the butler that he was going to be helping Pharaoh in 3 days, but the baker was going to end up dying. And so that's exactly what happened. But Joseph told the butler, "Remember me and put a good word in for me when you tell Pharaoh, because I helped you with this." But the butler didn't. Once the butler got out, he was excited about getting out, and he totally forgot about Joseph. And it said after 2 full years, Pharaoh had a dream. And so he told the butler, and then he told all of his wise men, and no one could figure out what the interpretation of the dream was. And so that's when the butler remembered what Joseph had done for him. And if you read over in Psalm 105, it says that Joseph's soul entered the iron in the prison when he had those shackles around his feet, and the word of the Lord proved and tested him during that time in prison. And according to history, he was in prison for quite a while, and about 10 years. And I just thought that was a bad circumstance, but he still kept the word of the Lord, the dreams that God spoke to him when he told his brothers and his father. And he never let go of it, and he knew it was going to happen. And here he was in the prison. He didn't know. And how many of us would hold on to it through all of that? I know in my heart, I know I wouldn't. But I'm crying out to God that I would, and that I could stand. And we are standing. And so Pharaoh had this dream. And he said, "Behold, there came out of the Nile 7 well-favored cows, sleek, handsome, and fat, and they grazed in the reed grass of the pasture. And behold, 7 other cows came up after them, and they were gaunt and ugly, and they stood by the fat cows. And the ill-favored, gaunt, and ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows. And then Pharaoh awoke. And then he fell back asleep, and behold, a second time 7 ears of grain came out of one stalk, and they were plump and healthy. And then 7 ears of thin and blighted grain sprouted and was parched by the east wind. And the 7 thin ears of grain devoured the 7 plump and fat ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream." And that really bothered him. He wanted to know what that was. And so the butler remembered who interpreted his dream, so he told Pharaoh that Joseph had interpreted his dream. And so Pharaoh called Joseph out of the prison, and he said, "I have dreamed." He sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. But first Joseph shaved himself, changed his clothes, and made himself presentable, and then he came into Pharaoh's presence. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I have dreamed a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. And I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream and interpret it." And Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It is not in me. God, not I, will give Pharaoh a favorable answer and interpret it." And right there it showed how much he trusted God with his life, and it didn't matter. Circumstances didn't move him. it didn't matter who it was, whether it was a servant, whether he was the king, who he was talking to. It didn't matter. He knew, he trusted God, and he trusted that God would speak, because that's what God had done at each point through all these difficult times in his life. And so Pharaoh explained the dreams to him, and so Joseph interpreted the dreams, and he said, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. And he explained that there was going to be 7 years of good and plenty, and then 7 years of famine, and very difficult famine. And he told Pharaoh to seek out and provide a man of understanding, wise, and set him over the land to know how to govern and manage the crops for the next 7 years, so they would have food during the 7 years of thin and famine, where there would be no food growing. And so Pharaoh was like, the only person I know is you. You're the only one. And it seemed good to Pharaoh, and it seemed good to all the servants of Pharaoh. And he says, you have charge over all my house, and all my people shall be governed according to your word, with reverence, submission, and obedience. Only in matters of the throne will I be greater than you are. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in official vestments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And just look at what God did for Joseph right here. He went from being in the dungeon for 10 years, but he was still faithful even in that dungeon. He never let go of the word of God, and God brought him out. I mean, who would have ever thought being an inmate to being the governor of the land? But God knew that a long time ago, and Joseph never let it escape. So they had the 7 years of plenty, then they had the 7 years of famine. But during those 7 good years, Joseph, they stored up all the extra grain they were making, and then as the famine hit the whole land during that last 7 years, that's when Joseph's family came down from Israel and came down to Egypt to find food. And then there it was. That's when God fulfilled those dreams that Joseph had when he was a young man. And Joseph remembered the dreams he had about his brothers, and he wept because he knew God did it. And a lot of us know the story from that point, where he had showed favor to his brother, and God took care of his whole family. His dad came and saw him, and he restored the whole situation. His brothers weren't envious of him. They had dropped all that offense, and it was a reunion of what God had done. And how many of us are facing these situations and circumstances in our lives today? And what are we doing about it? Are we just getting confused more and more? Or are we locking our heart in and crying out to God for Him to show us what to do, and for Him to lead and direct and guide us each day? And that's what's going to make us through these times in our life, and this period of our life of all this chaos that we're seeing and all this confusion. And we're just so grateful that we could come and share with you today and be with you on this radio program. And we're here Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 8:30 to 9 at WCAB. And you can watch the rest of our videos and all of our testimonies that are on that website at wordoffaithfellowship.org. And we thank you very much.